trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this podcast is coming to you being recorded from my adventure van smack dab after the conclusion of the Western States 100 on my way back to Colorado. What a fantastic weekend for our CTS athletes. Congratulations to winners Courtney DeWalter and Tom Evans, as well as all of the finishers of the Western States 100. Hopefully we'll get to do a quick recap of that race. But for now, this episode of the podcast is all about blood testing and using blood testing to inform your training. I don't need to tell you that with the proliferation of testing services like Inside Tracker, as well as some of the more advanced services that combine both blood and genetic profiling, athletes are having a harder and harder time discerning and navigating this ever-changing and complicated landscape. So enter into the fold a professional like Charlie Pedlar. Charlie started out as a research assistant for the British Olympic Association, and since then has held a number of high performance positions in both team and endurance sports. He also works in the commercial space as the chief science officer for Orreco, which provides blood testing services for athletes, namely in team sports like basketball, football, and soccer. And so I wanted to leverage the constellation of Charlie's different expertises in all of these areas, being involved in the commercial space, as well as a researcher, as well as working with athletes, in order to demystify blood testing for athletes out there. Now, in a perfect world, we would all have somebody like Charlie to help look at our blood results and determine what is actually going on. And in fact, when I have athletes that I am working with, I use people in my extended network like Charlie in order to determine what is going on with athletes' blood work. However, I realize that that's not practical for many of you out there. You're going to go to your primary care provider, or you're going to use a service like Inside Tracker, and you're going to rely simply on the results and or your own interpretation of those results in order to make sense out of what is going on. So this podcast is an attempt to help you DIY your blood testing if you choose to undertake it, as well as what to look for if you want to bring a professional into the equation. So with that as a backdrop, I'm getting right out of the way. Here's my conversation all about blood testing with Charlie Pedlar. Welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you coming on all the way from the UK.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Good to have an invitation.
Excellent. So we're going to talk a lot about blood biomarkers and probably deviate, as we were talking about offline, about how it's difficult to talk about them in isolation. We have to take in the whole context of things. But before we get into the whole context of the athlete, let's talk about the whole context of you, so our listeners can get to know you a little bit more. Tell the listeners a little bit more about what you do professionally in some of your areas of research.
Sure. Yeah, no, I consider myself to have one of the most interesting jobs out there, studying and working with athletes all around human performance. So I have one foot in academia as a research professor at St Mary's University in Twickenham, and then and that's in London. And then I also work with athletes primarily through a company called Orreco, which is kind of disclosure to get out there from the start. Orreco provides blood biomarker testing for pro athletes and elite athletes. And so that gives me a good kind of broad kind of perspective on the science underpinning what we do, and then the sort of reality of what's useful and relevant on the ground when it comes to training and trying to stay healthy while training sometimes to excess.
Well, so you already touched on this, and to set the table a little bit further, I've been involved in sport and using blood biomarkers mainly in sport for a couple of decades now. And I will say that the landscape on this has shifted quite dramatically, because it used to be where we had to kind of force our athletes to go to their primary care provider. The coaches would insist on a certain type of blood panel. And there was always this communication gap between the coach and the primary care provider as to why they needed certain markers that they did. we would then take all of those and kind of track them ourselves. And to be honest with you, it was a lot of like stabbing in the dark, because it wasn't until maybe the mid 90s or early 2000s to where a lot of the research underpinning what we're now seeing today in terms of how to use these markers to inform sport performance started to actually emerge. And now it's almost shifted to the kind of the other side of the spectrum, to where the instant you get one blood test, you're then kind of assaulted with a myriad of different markers and pieces of information and what to do. And I need more salmon and more iron and kind of all this other stuff, just based on one kind of based on one draw. And to see the arc of that, the arc of that use, right, or the arc of the information has actually been quite astounding to me. But let's back up a little bit and let's talk about like kind of this value proposition of monitoring athletes' blood work. And any athlete, elite athlete or regular athlete, if an athlete is considering this, like what fundamentally should they be thinking about in terms of what can they actually get out of it in order to inform their performance?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of things, a lot of points you touched on there in your intro around the sort of history of biomarker monitoring and why we would do it, what we would get from it, and how it's evolved. But I think that fundamentally the word that comes to mind is objectivity, in that, you know, you can perceive how well your training is going, you can perceive how healthy you are, you can perceive how well your diet is, but you can't necessarily know with some certainty. And rightly or wrongly, athletes will get that from a blood test sometimes. So now they can still get erroneous data and they can still misinterpret that data and all those things, but it's a number on a piece of paper that's related to a reference range that brings objectivity to what they're doing. So sometimes it confirms that things are going well, they're healthy, everything is where they would want it to be. Sometimes it throws up surprises and things that they can do differently. And sometimes it can help to provide answers when things have gone wrong, or when an athlete is in a state of, should we call it, unexplained underperformance. So I think there's those three reasons why it might add something useful to the process of training and performing.
And it's become so accessible now, and I guess more commonly known, because a lot of the podcasts and the lay articles have kind of proliferated the use of it, and it's just and like I said, it's been more accessible. But it started to creep into not just looking at, are you not in a disease state or are you in a healthy state?
Yes.
To this optimization concept. And, you know, whether this is the, you know, bro science biohacking, you know, kind of movement that's been, you know, propagated over the past several years or what, but can we really use blood biomarkers to say that you are in an optimized state? And the reason that I mention that is because kind of the entire dialogue that you discuss with an athlete in terms of why they should get blood testing, it really emanates from this fundamental piece of, what are you trying to do with it? Are you trying to figure out just, hey, are you healthy to train? Or can we explain this underperformance syndrome via blood biomarkers? Or are we trying to take a normally healthy individual and somehow supercharge the adaptations that they're getting from training? Yeah.
Well, I think the answer is no to much of that, in that this concept of optimization is a difficult one. And if we just take a step back and think about training and recovery, we're trying to repeatedly stress our physiology and balance that with recovery, so that we then supercompensate and improve our performance. And that might be through changes in strength. It might be changes in some other structural systems, like, you know, bone health and so on. It might be aerobic capacity and our ability to kind of sustain high workloads. And the whole time with training, when training is very successful, we're moving closer to our genetic potential. Now with everyone, that's going to be different. We're all individuals. So optimizing, there's no magic number that we need to hit for each of these biomarkers. And actually, when it comes to blood testing, it can be quite a blunt tool, because if you think about why, we're really drawing on years and years of research in medicine and health for these blood tests, and the reference ranges are all created so that the data that we compare ourselves to when we have a test result, those reference ranges are based on a healthy population, in inverted commas, so not necessarily an athletic population. So we have to think about how we interpret the results of any tests with that in mind. That, and we do work in football, and one of the phrases that we use when we're looking at reference ranges is that you're comparing yourself to the players on the pitch, but you're also comparing yourself to the fans. And you think about the breadth of people that are healthy in that fact. It's not the same as your elite athlete. So you have to imagine that quite often there's a different reference range for each of these biomarkers that applies to elite athletes than there is for the general population. That's not always available. So it might be that we're regularly flagged as athletes outside of a clinical or a normal reference range because we're experiencing a lot of muscle damage, for example, or we have as we train our cardiovascular system, we tend to get something called plasma volume expansion. So that can dilute the red cell portion of the blood, and so it can look like we're anemic when we're actually not. It's a pseudo anemia. So sometimes we're out of range from the general population as well. So either way, the point is that we're individuals here, and we're looking for clues as to what might be a real deficiency or a real biomarker of concern, but it's not going to be a definitive answer until we have lots and lots more data, and ideally, you want you want a few blood tests on yourself in order to build up your own reference ranges. I'm sure we'll get onto that in the conversation.
Yeah, but I think what I want to try to bring out is this is what I call terrain trap avoidance, right? And a lot of training, to be frank with you, if I just put my coaching hat on for a little bit, a lot of training is just not screwing up. You just got to keep the athlete healthy, and you prevent the zeros on the calendar, and you prevent them from getting injured, and you just let time take care of the adaptive process with reasonable training. Yeah. And I keep coming back to this, and I wanted to quote unquote optimize performance in part with the use of blood biomarkers for years. And what I've begun to appreciate, I think, is encapsulated in just kind of that recent dialogue that you went through, that it's a very blunt tool. And if you're looking for something, to drill down on a very, very surgically on a number, and I'll give a classic example in the endurance world, which would be hematocrit and or hemoglobin. And for years, we would try to drill down on that and try to optimize that. I mean, I'm emphasizing that word intentionally. We would try to optimize either one or a combination of those numbers in order to kind of like drive performance. But what we found is there was a lot of noise within that signal. And you mentioned some within the plasma volume, and you can actually have some within the, just the whole milieu of what's going on within the testing environment. And so what I've begun to appreciate is to back up a little bit and say, let's just make sure things aren't completely screwed up, and avoid this very narrow definition of optimization where we're looking at fractions of improvement within whatever kind of number, and take the bigger win of the athlete is healthy. Let's just go ahead and apply training.
Yes. Yeah, no, I hear you. That makes sense. I think we mustn't go too far down that route, I think, because there are some things that will be fundamental to performance, particularly endurance performance, that will stand out very clearly in a blood test. So one of those is if somebody is genuinely anemic and we have a detailed enough iron panel, then that clearly leads to endurance underperformance because we're not able to produce the red blood cells that we need to carry the oxygen, and we see a decrease in that hemoglobin value. I mentioned there's that pseudo anemia, but we're still talking kind of within physiological levels. It can dip way further. Something like hemoglobin can dip further into an anemic state, which can then have profound effects on performance. So you've got to catch those things. With a blood test, it'll tell you very clearly if you're iron deficient and in an anemic state. Optimization, though, is something different because we know we can often do better and adapt our physiology further than we have already. Take, for example, taking an athlete going up to high altitude, where there's a stimulation of red blood cell production through erythropoiesis, and then we have a direct effect on our iron stores to produce more red blood cells. And then when we come down from altitude, the theory goes that we can then perform better if we optimize that process in some way. And that's a time where we know we can retune our physiology to a new environment that causes a change in our iron requirements in that particular example, and the biomarkers can be really useful in preempting that problem or measuring the change in some way. So
this is the old ferritin threshold that a lot of coaches will be familiar with that have used altitude protocols. And once again, we've been using altitude protocols for a long time. And you're absolutely right. I feel like we kind of threw a dart at a dartboard with the blindfold with some of the earlier altitude interventions where we would do an altitude panel and we would say, okay, as long as your ferritin's above 26, we'll just pick a number between 20 and 30. You and I have both kind of heard all of them. As long as your ferritin's above this magical level of 26, you're a candidate for this altitude intervention. That's kind of what you're getting at there. And we've started to get better at that, I would say, in the future, but with the original altitude interventions, we knew that we needed something to base it off of. And we, like I said, we just literally kind of guessed at what that something was. And since then, we've kind of narrowed it down a little bit.
Yeah. So while we're on the subject of altitude and iron, I mean, there's now more and more really big studies where they've been able to track changes in, say, hemoglobin mass with iron status markers. And there seems to be this threshold when you think about many data points on a graph, and you draw a line through the data. There seems to be a threshold around 50 for ferritin, which seems to be a bit of an inflection point where if you're below 50, you're more likely to be your body's trying to absorb more iron, whereas if you're above 50, those systems are downregulated. But then if you look at the individual data spots, it's a huge cloud of data. Yeah. So for some people, that 50 might be absolutely no evidence that they're looking for more iron. Others, it might be, it could be that they can go even down to 20 or lower and still be, there's a broad range in both directions. And so I think those thresholds they're trying to be a standard threshold for the whole population just doesn't work. So and this is why often you can develop a theory with sort of data around what's happening, but it might not necessarily, you might not respond in exactly the same way as another person will respond to the same treatment. So
yeah. Okay, yeah. Let's back up a little bit before we start to talk about optimization ranges and individual Bayesian statistics and things like that. Let's get into where people can start, because there are going to be a number of people that are curious. Okay, I want to start tracking these things. And there's a whole host of companies that are out there, but then each company kind of offers their own like little suite of things. And they've tried to categorize them to, this is the health suite, and this is the endurance suite, and this is the platinum suite of biomarkers that you can actually look at. But let's take it from an endurance athletic population, right? You have an athlete comes to you, Charlie, and says, "Hey, listen, I think something's going on. I want to start, tracking my blood work in order to get a fix on that." What's the standard set of tests that they can start to look at and track over periods of time?
Yeah, well, I think it boils down to probably only 3 or 4 things that you would say is like a really fundamental test. And I think most athlete groups that I work with now, would recognize that. So you want to get what we call a FBC, but in the North America would be a CBC. So checking all your populations of red and white cells are kind of within healthy or expected ranges, and then underpinning that with your iron status, normally a ferritin value, or a more detailed iron panel, ideally. And then vitamin D is the other one that's got a pretty good body of evidence behind it. And really, the best bang for your buck with that is if you're actually deficient, as opposed to trying to optimize to some super normal threshold. There's many other things that you can measure. Folate, B12 would be important ones as well for the red cell production. There's a host of nutrition-related markers, magnesium, biomarkers associated with quality of your diet, fruits, vegetable intake, these kinds of things. But I think the critical ones that I would point people towards would be that full blood count with ferritin and vitamin D, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, in the US, that's a standard suite of tests. You can go to your doctor and get it's a complete blood count with an iron profile is typically how it's served up. The one that a lot of athletes will either choose to do either in combination of that or as some sort of permutation of a commercial service is a complete metabolic panel. Yeah. And I've always kind of viewed that as a nicety, not a necessity. And I wanted to kind of get your opinion on that, because that's another host of things that you can actually look at as well.
Yeah, many of the markers in there are around kind of homeostasis, so things like electrolytes that actually, they're almost always going to be in the normal range in a healthy individual. So they're not going to tell you too much extra. Other things like liver function tests that come as pretty standard with a hospital blood test, again, are most likely to be pretty normal in the absence of any kind of symptoms. So I don't see huge value in those. Things like lipids, cholesterol, and so on are useful, but we're assuming here we've got a pretty healthy, well-trained population. There's so many different biomarkers when you start going through the list that you could start adding in, and it's a bit of a sliding scale. So one of the ones that comes up increasingly is that endocrine markers for example, trying to understand your energy status. Are you fueling enough? Is there things like thyroid tests, for example? There's reasonably well established thresholds there for free T3, for example, as a marker of energy status. That would be helpful in avoiding low energy availability for long periods of time. In males, testosterone is a really useful, interesting marker to understand if you're as an anabolic marker, but as a general marker of recovery, even better if it's combined with cortisol. So they accumulate that like that, and you can get insights from all of these things. But if you measure enough things, you'll find things that are out of range. But it's the trick is in how you sort of put it all together and interpret that. Inflammation, is a great. It is very informative to sort of try and understand how inflamed you are, but only if you've collected enough data to understand more what the chronic picture is. So as athletes, we might be inflamed transiently for periods of time, particularly if we've done a lot of eccentric loading on hill running, or we've done an unaccustomed strength training session, lots of muscle damage. Secondary to that would be an inflammatory process. So you might have raised inflammation. By the way, that's not the ideal time to be having a blood test, because everything's going to be out out of whack. So there's more and more things to add to the list, but I think it still comes back, like you say, back to those fundamental few things. I think are probably the most bang for your buck when it comes to biomarker testing.
So let's kind of continue the best practices theme, right? You started out with complete blood count with an iron panel. Let's go into what you mentioned, timing of that, and we can bring in some of the nuances of working with female athletes around their menstrual cycle.
Yes.
Timing of those draws, either relative to their training and or menstrual cycle. And then the frequency of those, if we're trying to track it over time, monthly, weekly, quarterly, and things like that. I wonder, can you expand on that a little bit as well?
Yeah. So I think firstly, like doing the testing well. So if you're going to invest in a blood test, don't just rock up to a clinic, have a test drawn after a run, or when you've just had.
Well, you're still in your kit.
Well, yeah, try and standardize it as best you can. And we, the way that we historically done that with athletes is to get fasted, rested samples in the morning. So that just means do it before breakfast. And it means do it before you do any training. And then to extend that a little bit further, try and avoid having done excessive or unaccustomed exercise the day before. If it's just a half an hour recovery run or something, that's not going to have an impact in a trained individual. But if you've gone out and done it, a 20 miler, or you've done a race or something, then that could have a significant impact. So just think about standardizing those conditions so that the next time you test, you repeat the same thing. You can then see if there's actually any physiological differences, not just differences in the time of day, or the fact that you're in a different state of recovery than you were for the first test. We've written. There's a whole section in a paper we've written in Sports Medicine in 2019, which I can give you the link to. It's an open access paper, and it gives you a whole host of things. And actually, there's 10 points of guidelines for how to get good quality blood test data. So otherwise, you're just adding a lot more noise to the already noisy signal.
And I'll mention, while you're thinking about that, that's hard enough. And this is what I always come back to with the proposition of monitoring biomarkers with athletes. Simply standardizing the testing environment just amongst the training, going into it fasted with a rest day in advance or an off day in advance. Yeah. That can be tricky enough. That in and of itself it presents a point of friction for the athlete to actually go and especially for a normal athlete who has a job and kids and they're running around being the soccer coach and things like that. Yeah. So we start to get into these practical elements of actually using blood biomarkers in a realistic situation. And for athletes that are out there that are thinking about this is a very realistic one. It takes time. You have to standardize it. You can't just go on a whim. You're not going to be able to put a patch on and do it. There's some realistic practical considerations in order to create as standardized of a testing environment as possible, so you're not getting as much noise coming through whatever the lab values are actually telling you.
Yeah. And I think that can put people off too. Yeah. We're not talking about standardizing every little tiny detail. It's just that simple, if you can, that simple thing of doing it at the same time of day, doing it before breakfast.
That's hard enough, man.
I know it's hard. And it depends what resources you have available. So some providers will be able to send out a phlebotomist to your house, have a test done at the time when you want it to be done, and take the samples off to the lab, and you don't have to think too much about that process. Whereas for others, if they're trying to get an appointment in a clinic, after with a referral from a physician or however they might be doing it, then that can be significantly more challenging to standardize those things. And the phlebotomists often are not thinking that way either. You're in and out as part of a whole roster of tests that are being done that day. And so, because we would advocate being rested for up to half an hour before a test if you can, 10 minutes kind of minimum of sitting down, but that's not always possible in a busy clinic. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so we've got standardized test environment. Yeah. What about frequency?
So frequency, well, some things are going to change quicker than others, and certain things you might, depending on how detailed the blood panel is that you have access to, there's no point in constantly measuring things that are normal every time you test them. We typically would do 3 to 4 venous blood tests per year with a elite athlete.
So quarterly, basically, is what.
Quarterly, yeah. I mean, we have done them more frequently than that. Maximum monthly. And that's in a very well-resourced thing with a targeted. We want to monitor this specific thing and do it regularly enough to understand what the picture is. A whole different sort of conversation is around point of care testing for recovery, that like from capillary blood samples, and you might do those much more frequently. So, measuring things like oxidative stress, inflammation, sometimes testosterone, cortisol, urea, these things. If you have some pro teams now are doing this frequently, they're doing it, after in microcycles of training. But that's not. I don't think that's quite what we're talking about here. We're talking about more the something that's accessible to a larger wedge of the population.
Yeah, not everybody's going to have one of the iStat models where they can just kind of like take those on demand almost. They're looking at going into a lab, they're getting a venous puncture, they're getting 3 tubes of blood drawn, or some 2 to 4 tubes of blood drawn, and that's kind of the extent of it.
Yeah. So you mentioned,
but it's an interesting point of advocacy, right? Quarterly, right? So the time investment that I mentioned earlier, that might be clumsy, right? Or it might have some friction associated with it. You're looking at only being able to or only having to do that once every 3 months. A lot of people will look at that as a reasonable proposition. Okay, I can identify a period of training in time, can set aside my schedule to get something done quarterly. However, here's the hitch and the giddy up, right? If you're looking at monitoring things once and then every 3 months, there's a 3-month period of time in between those two to which you kind of don't know if the intervention is actually working.
Yes. So this is where quarterly is just purely based on a 12-month calendar, but actually, what is the athlete doing in that year? When are good timely opportunities for testing? So, for example, if there's a build-up going to happen to a key event, there's no point in waiting until the week before the event to do the blood test. Bring it back to earlier in that build-up, so that you can make sure that as you're needing these nutrients, as you're needing this iron, as you're kind of drawing on this physiology, that it's all there and it's when it's working well. So timing them around those kind of events makes sense. It's also not really worth testing if you're about to go on a break. So scheduling around key events and early on in the build up to those events would make sense, and that might those cycles are going to vary between individuals depending if you're somebody who races numerous times through the year, or if you do 1 or 2 marathons in a year. It's going to vary a lot by individual, but giving that some thought obviously will optimize it further, and that concept of quarterly kind of goes out the window then. But I think 4 times per year in general seems to be a sensible thing. If you're going to altitude, then before heading off to altitude, with enough time to maybe try and improve your iron status or something like that before you go would make sense. But yeah, so that, I think that optimizes or improves that quarterly thing a little bit further.
You're using the blood test as almost as a little bit of a hurdle to clear in advance of intensified training. And here's how we've used it and I'm sure you're aware of this. Here's how we've actually used it in a high performance context in the coaching world, is we actually back it up 1 quarter. So we lay out the whole 12 months or 18 months. We identify the periods of time that are intensified training periods leading into the Olympics or whatever big competition that somebody actually has. And we don't want to test right before that, because there's not like the information is you got to train. Like, sorry, like the Olympics are, 6 months from now, you got to train like right there. So the information is not all that valuable at that one moment in time. Exactly. It's valuable in advance of that, with enough time that's whatever intervention you want to do, whether you're doing some sort of iron supplementation or whatever it is, where that intervention where you need to throw that intervention at the athlete at that point. So typically what we'll do is we'll back it up 1 quarter or even 6 months to start the profiling process, so that the table is set during that intensified training period that the athlete has the best opportunity possible.
Yes. Yeah, no, that exactly describes it well. And I think you kind of, you're going to organize your life around those things too. So just like, well, for people like me who's not an elite athlete, I'm going to be thinking, right, I've got this pair of shoes that I'm going to be training in, and these are the ones I'm going to be saving for the event. It's kind of, it's same thing. But you also, like, I'm not going to start training intensely so the total athlete, in terms of the load, the life stresses and so on. If you're, I remember when I was doing my PhD, I wasn't able to do the kind of physical training that I wanted to do. Or if, so there's other life events that people have that are going to result in this sort of total stress on them. And they'll factor in the type of races they're doing. Maybe, some things less flexible, like the Olympics, like you mentioned, but you have to take that all into account in your planning. And I think the biomarker testing slots into your calendar at sensible times, which you would work on with your coach, or when you're sitting down and making a plan, you would work out when is the most sensible time here to have a blood test to get the most benefit, in the months that follow.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of like looking at, once again, I'm looking at it through the train trap avoidance lens, right?
Yes.
I have run into this with athletes where, and this is a coaching error, where we've introduced biomarker testing just in advance of a really important training phase, maybe not an intensified training phase, but a really important training phase. And something is just kind of awry. It's not necessarily concerning, but it gets in the athlete's head in terms of, oh my God, I'm not optimized to absorb all of this training or to adapt from all of this training. And so I kind of go back. The reason that's a coaching error is because I kind of go back to, well, what you should have done is done that 3 or 6 months ago. So you have enough time for some sort of course correction, whether it's a supplement or even just a normal nutrition, intervention, or kind of whatever it is. Because it's just like changing your shoes on race day or something, like right before race day, right? Where you're introducing that wrinkle where you kind of shouldn't have. I think the athletes that are looking at taking this on, like, give yourself some runway, because the course corrections that you apply do not happen instantaneously in most cases. Most of the time it's a month or 3 months before you're actually going to see some sort of realistic improvement.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a really important point there, which is the psychology around this, and giving people a piece of information about themselves that they didn't know before. And some athletes are going to overthink that dramatically. And so I would always try and encourage not to overinterpret a biomarker profile. It's one piece of data that, you have to put into a whole, reservoir of other information that you're looking at, and much of that doesn't need data. It's just it's your observations. It's changes in mood. It's all these other pieces, and sometimes a blood test can have the opposite effect than you want it to have if it's taken too seriously by the athlete. So. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna talk about that over psychologizing when we get into the exotic biomarkers, and I've reserved a specific spot for that. We're both going to have to kind of rack our brains a little bit on it, because I do think exotic is the right word. But before we leave this this dialogue of best practices, I'd be remiss if we didn't come back to one piece, and that is how should women set this up? Women who have a regular menstrual cycle. We talked about standardizing it based off of the training, easy day beforehand or off day beforehand, morning and fasting. How should women approach biomarker testing in terms of trying to standardize that component of it?
Yeah, and that's something that hasn't been well defined anywhere. I haven't seen anything that really explains well how you should take into account the menstrual cycle or hormonal contraceptive cycle for a female athlete, and so the thing is that you've got menstrual cycle length that might vary slightly between individuals, and the phases will vary slightly between individuals. And again, it's that same sort of idea that we're trying to look for a change in the background physiology here. So taking into account the phase of the cycle would make most sense. And we know that things like iron metabolism will vary across the menstrual cycle. So you do need to test at the same time. In fact, we have a review in European Journal of Sports Science that covers some of that. The hormone hepcidin that controls iron absorption will be slightly different through the cycle, and so you might have lower ferritin values, for example, from memory towards the end of the cycle. So you need to, again, it comes down to taking that into account, and say you had a menstrual bleed that occurred, so what's known as the period, testing at that time is probably not ideal. I would say testing a week into the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle probably makes more sense when things are somewhat stable, and then trying to factor that into future blood tests as well. So it just adds another layer of complexity to the standardization.
But I mean, your point that it's hard, we can't draw on research to say, okay, this is the best time. You're once again trying to train, trap, avoid. I'm using that analogy again, and you're saying based somewhere around the follicular phase to make sure that there's more of a homeostatic environment.
Yes. So during that phase, you're in this kind of rebuilding phase in terms of the endometrial lining. We have an estrogen dominant phase. This tend to have fewer symptoms, fewer off days in terms of training during that phase. And so I would say that's probably the best time to test. But there's no kind of rules around that. And it's yet to be decided. I mean, ideally you would test kind of every phase and then be able to factor that in and say, on this phase, this biomarker is X, and then you have a reference range that's that builds up for that particular reference. But you just can't test that often and get that much information. So picking your day so you're not testing right in the middle of your period, for example, would be sensible.
Okay, so now that we've got these best practices, right? We're standardizing when we're taking them based on training and on the menstrual cycle. Let's kind of go down to the interpretation. And there's kind of there's three flavors of this, right? So the first flavor is through an athlete's primary care provider. They're going to go into their doctor and they're going to request a blood test, and then they're going to get the results back, and it's going to compare their whatever shows up in their blood to a reference range, which is you use the analogy earlier of it's everybody in the stands, right? It's based on everybody. It's not based on them. That's one flavor of the analysis. They're just going to look at that and say, am I in these normal ranges? Second flavor of it is if they get it done through a commercial, some sort of commercial setting, Inside Tracker, the company or the company that you work for. How do you pronounce it again? You're going to have to remind me.
Orreco.
Okay. Orreco. And it's going to take those, and especially if they have a series of them, it's going to tailor the reference range in some fashion. I'm going to leave it as generic as that, and you can expand upon that if you want to, but it's taking this reference range and individualizing it in some fashion. And the third flavor is, and this is what I try to do very poorly, this is why I have you on the podcast, and what you do professionally is they bring in the big hammers. They bring in the professionals to look at it and say, okay, this is what's really going on. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you had any commentary on those different types of how we actually interpret these things, because it's always been difficult for me as a coach because there's a lot of noise. And once again, I'm just trying not to screw it up from a blood profiling standpoint. I'm just trying to make sure that the athlete is healthy, that they're going to be able to adapt to the training, and that there's not some sort of, you use the word disease state, but under training, under performance syndrome, or some sort of unideal state. That's the word I was looking for. Some sort of unideal underlying biochemistry going on when I'm applying heavy training. So do you have any thoughts on these different levels of interpretations? Because we're going to have athletes across that entire spectrum. They try to DIY it with their doctor, they go to a commercial setting, and or they're going to bring on a practitioner. And what are some guidelines that they can use to kind of weed through wherever they are in that across that spectrum?
Yeah. So if you are working with a company that has a lot of data to hand, then it does make that kind of more advanced analysis a little bit easier. If you don't, then you kind of, you have your blood test data, and I've seen, it's amazing that you still find people trying to find their previous blood tests in an email chain somewhere, and it's a PDF that's attached, and then you're kind of opening that screen, and then you're flipping up another screen, and it's like, oh, hang on a minute, no, I'm looking at the wrong one, and which page is it on? And then you're going through, and it's like, oh, I'm sure I had ferritin tested that time, and then you're scribbling them down on a piece of paper or putting them into an Excel sheet, and it's pretty messy and pretty clunky. Now, the technology has been around for a long time to do it much better than that, in that, you can, nice interface where you can see your historic data, you can see the reference range from the lab, you can maybe even see an athlete range that just takes into account or makes a guess at what would be, not a guess, but some informed reason why there would be an athletic range within that. And then also plots an individual adaptive range around the data. And so that, and there's many different ways to do that. And we have a partner, we've done research with Professor John Newell over in Ireland and his team that will look at this kind of modeling the data here, so that you can really individualize and individualize it with context around the data as well. So you can get really advanced with the way that you kind of you interpret the data. But what those adaptive ranges give you is a bit of a guide as to, is this normal for you? And so I don't know if you even we're seeing them all over the place now. Even in Strava, they tell you what your training volume is this week. Is that kind of it broadly in line with where you normally sit? Is it higher or lower than where you sit? And you can see that kind of cloud behind your data that shows you something about interprets it something a bit more individualized to you. But unless you're collecting data quite frequently, and you have enough data to start to build up your own range, and you have some skills around calculating that, it's probably just as effective to kind of look at the data, judge, what kind of, direction is that, higher or lower than previous tests you've had done. If you want to go more advanced than that, then calculating something like a standard deviation from a mean value or a percentile. If you've got outliers, then using a median value and looking for percentiles above and below that can give you a nice simple way of saying, is this normal for me, or how far away from my normal is that? But really, you want to have 5, 6, 7 tests in the bank in order to get an accurate enough average, or mean or median.
So, okay, I'm going to unpack a few things, and I'm going to give you the earmarks so that we don't forget them. The first is individualization versus optimization. I'm going to pick on the commercial companies. Yeah,
you might be modeling data that's chronically abnormal. Actually, one time when you have a normal, a high result, is actually normal. It is more optimal than the others. So
okay, we're gonna do that right now, because I gotta get this. I gotta get this beef off my chest before I forget about it. Okay, so when somebody goes to a commercial, when somebody goes to a direct to consumer commercial type of company, they get these things back, and the companies are trying to create a value proposition to the athlete, kind of starting back to our original discussion point. One of those value propositions is they try to present what they are are determining is an optimized range. And I'm intentionally emphasizing the word optimized because I think that that's important. When in many cases, if not all cases, what is actually being presented is the individualized range, or something that is normal for the individual. That can be the optimal range, but it's not necessarily the optimized range, because as you just mentioned, that athlete could be chronically under or over, depending upon the marker that you're looking, under or over what should be optimal for them. And it has, seeing that vocabulary has just, this is just a personal gripe that I'm going to take out on you. Seeing that vocabulary has just always been irritating to me, because like I have had this with a commercial company. I had an athlete who I knew was anemic. We started doing blood profiling, and it kept telling me and her that that they were in their optimized range for a few of these markers, when I knew that it was it was certainly an unoptimal state, but all it was doing was looking at their regular thing and saying, okay, this is like within your regular norm. And I'm just like, no. So I wanted, since you work on the commercial side, I wanted you to kind of like peel that curtain back a little bit for the listeners out there and kind of describe the difference between an individualized range and an optimized range, and how we shouldn't really kind of conflate those two.
Yes. Yeah. So, optimized suggests that at that point in time, the athlete is going to perform at their best. They have, let's say, they're not deficient in anything. All systems are operating as best they can operate. This is optimization, right? And so we don't necessarily, unless there's research out there to show if your biomarker X is in this range, or we tested this many athletes and all the ones that were performing at their best had this level of something to help us prove or get as close to the truth as we can, which is what we try to do in science and statistics, that might be an optimum range. A lot of times these companies are saying you're here against a whole load of other athletes who are in your similar maybe they're in similar sex or gender, similar age bracket, similar sport. This is where you sit. Now that might be a population that's not healthy, that you're compared against. So it's it's reference data, but it's not necessarily optimized or normative data. There's different terms here that mean slightly different things. So most of the reference ranges that you get from a blood test, from a clinical lab, will be quite a wide range, because it captures, like we were saying, the fans and the athletes, and it's a health to a sort of minimum standard. And with athletes, we're looking for this optimization. So that's why I think you have to be cautious around that. Just because it's individual to you doesn't mean it's necessarily optimal. One thing to look out for is whether or not your individualized range is sitting within the wide
reference range. Yeah.
And that's one check. Like if it's modeling you and saying you're normal and you're outside of the reference range, then it's that would suggest that it's not quite right. And so companies really shouldn't give you an individualized range unless it's well within unless it's actually narrowing in on what's already deemed to be a wide population normal range. So does that answer your question?
Well, but here's what I always come back to, and I've told this to a number of athletes. They don't know if you're performing well. It's not like you're inputting the training data or inputting the performance data and then correlating that with the blood biomarkers. It's taking the blood biomarkers in isolation, which you can do in certain circumstances. You can say, okay, this is an optimized range for whatever to produce the adaptation, but it's not like that necessarily. No, that is automatically going to be correlated or creates a performance. But the fact that there is, like, you don't even have anywhere to input that, at least amongst the commercial commercial outfits that I'm aware of. It's not like they're taking your training data and saying, oh my gosh, you're training really well, or you're performing really well here. here's your underlying blood biochemistry leading up into that. We're going to individualize your range based off of that. It's a very isolated point of view that is being presented.
I think this is the value, though, of retrospective analysis of data for endurance on an athlete. You can, and this doesn't happen enough, but if you were to put the data together and sit down with an athlete and review like when they felt they were going well, when they were performing well, what was their biomarker profile like then, and that enables you to kind of throw a lot of the sort of red flags or whatever out the window and say, well, actually, let's look at you as an individual. What was happening at this time? Can we explain? Did you do anything to address any issues that actually then led to a period of better performance or reduced negative symptoms that you might have been having, or off days, like actually enabled you to keep training? Because as you say, health and performance just go hand in hand. So if we can actually avoid stopping training, then if we can complete a planned training program, then we're more likely to perform to our best.
Well, it's analogous to what I teach our coaches to do with an athlete intake, is look at when they were training really well and what preceded that, or when they were performing really well and what preceded that from a training perspective. They're evaluating training log. They get a new athlete. They want to kind of like dig into what they were doing previously. When were they doing really well? And what was preceding that? And when did they suck? Like take those almost polar opposite ends of the spectrum and figure out what the themes were going into those. And what you're suggesting is coupling that, if you have the resources retrospectively with the blood biomarkers, and adding that into this storyline of how you would arrange nutrition interventions and training and things like that. I would absolutely be a huge advocate of that.
Yeah. We did this a while back and actually published a case study where we just mapped training sessions and adaptation we were doing monitored treadmill runs, looking at blood lactate responses over several training cycles through cross-country season in the winter, through to track season, through to Olympics. And when you mapped our iron markers alongside that, you could see clearly that the correspondence between drops in ferritin, drops in our biomarker panels, and heavy training phases. And you could really, like, by doing that retrospectively, you could really identify times when you would want to have blood tests done, but then also look to intervene and manage training load carefully. More recent examples, and this isn't in distance runners, but with menstrual cycle length and menstrual cycle features. Female athletes are a great, have this wonderful signal in their menstrual cycle that can kind of tell them a lot about how stressed and overloaded they are. In that menstrual cycle will extend at times when there's excessive life stresses. Also, menstrual cycle related symptoms, even injury flare-ups and things will occur by phase in the menstrual cycle. And so when you map on all the life events alongside those simple kind of menstrual cycle biomarkers, you get a really clear pattern that, these things are all integrated together, they're all linked together. And so, putting the biomarkers in, that was a lesson I learned very early on, was that, when, the time point that we test in terms of, heavy training versus lighter training weeks, altitude versus non-altitude, corresponding with big world championships or Olympics, these will have big disturbances on our systems if we depending on when we measure. So you have to take them into account in the process.
I'll leave a link to that case study that you just mentioned. That was an older one, man. You pulled it out of the memory bank. So it was published 10 years ago. I looked it up. I looked up, and when I was doing some research for this, I'll link to that. I'll link to that in the show notes. It's because I think it's a good one. But I want to move the dialogue a little bit to something that I mentioned earlier, and these are the more exotic markers that we start to see, and I've seen these start to become. The interest in them has certainly perked up. So we started with this very basic proposition of, hey, listen, just go get a complete blood count with an iron profile. And for the users that are not familiar with that, those are very basic markers: red blood cell count, hemoglobin, hematocrit. It's not very sexy, right? It's very, very simple. And I'm completely with you, Charlie. I think that that's enough to cover about 90% of the bases. And I don't get into this hyper optimization of all of these other things. But what I've started to notice more recently is this proliferation of what I'm calling these exotic markers. And they're exotic because they're taking ratios of certain biomarkers. And while, once again, I'm a very naive knucklehead within this, I don't work within the research world. While I understand a lot of the bioplausible mechanisms of why these ratios might actually be beneficial, I have a very difficult time actually finding much, if any, and most of the research is not very good. It's usually really old for whatever reason to support some of these ratios. And I know that there's a whole host of them now, and it's kind of an unfair question to cast a broad blanket on them. But I'm wondering if you just had any opinion on some of those, and if certain ones actually have a better basis of support to actually use.
I'm quite a fan of actually the testosterone cortisol ratio, and similar to that is the DHEA to cortisol ratio that you mentioned. But you do need to test frequently, and you do need to more than ever take into account that control that we mentioned around time of day and that kind of thing, because when you look at hormonal markers, they have fluctuations across the day and the night, and so you can be on hour by hour in the early part of the day, you can have quite big differences in the data. So that's very important. But over time, if you have enough data points, and when training is going very well, you will see consistent or increasing testosterone, for example, in a program that is, where the athlete is getting stronger and they're mentally healthy, in a positive state, then testosterone will go up in parallel with cortisol staying stable or going down. So that ratio is quite an important marker for recovery and performance. And conversely, we see the opposite when there's a negative state, negative spiral, excessive fatigue, energy depletion, and so on. So because of that variability, though, they're not always going to do exactly what you expect them to do. Sometimes you'll get erroneous markers, so you need to test often enough to plot what I call peppering a line that gives you a trajectory. Yeah. And so it becomes very expensive. Or you need to, if you look at the research studies, they tend to be big cohort studies where when you look at the mean and the standard deviation, it's moved in one direction, but you look at any one individual and it might not have done. So you lose the individual within those cohort studies. Can
I interrupt you for a second? So within that ratio, because once again, just looking at one of those, it's hard to find the signal through the noise with any one individual person. And then you combine the two, and like you said, they should be going in opposite directions if the training is going very well. But what I found when trying to use that from a very pragmatic utility point of view, it's just very difficult because there's just so much other context that you need to take into what is going on, and you can't just say, oh, you need to rest more, or okay, the training's really good right now, because in a lot of cases you get these opposing signals where the biomarker is telling you one thing and the training and the performance is telling you another thing, and then it's like the athlete kind of gets confused as to, okay, which one should I trust? Should I trust the biomarker? Should I trust the performance, or whatever?
Yeah, and it's confusing because sometimes they go in they don't necessarily go in the direction that you expect them to go in, and
exactly.
Or there's a phasic process that they go through, where initially you might present as fatigued and exhausted, whereas actually this is just part of that damage recovery sequence. That then, so the timing is very, very important. And, sometimes sometimes you might do a hard training session, you don't sleep well the following night, and so measuring the next day, you're a mess. Whereas actually, if 2 nights later after some good sleep, you've got a really positive compensatory response. So you've got, without like really understanding the physiology around training and that each of these biomarkers, like you say, it becomes very noisy. But there's definitely powerful signals within there if you do understand it. So there's a researcher early on, this is 20 or more years ago, but a guy called Professor Christian Cook is a New Zealand researcher, has very compelling data and some nice publications around testosterone cortisol ratio responding according to whether or not you've slept well, whether or not your cycle he's done experiments where giving a team positive feedback, positive team talks, and that actually changing the anabolic environment within the physiology versus negative ones, reducing the response. And so it's very much like context specific. There's a large brain element here to those hormonal responses, because it's controlled by the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is fundamental to all of these responses, and the sympathetic nervous system as well. So it's really, really interesting. But yeah, it's very hard for the lay athlete to go out and measure those kinds of things and get meaningful insights from the data. I completely agree with you there.
So, okay, I'll completely buy this testosterone to cortisol ratio being a thing that you could kind of add into the hero metrics. Like if we could wave a magic wand and say, this is the profile, CBC with an iron profile, and that I would take that. If I could track that every 2 to 3 months with an athlete, I could do something with that. Here's the final thing for you to ponder. And I didn't put this in the outline, and I thought I put it. I had it initially. Let me back up. I had it initially in that line. I was like, no, I'm just going to spring this on Charlie at the end to get your kind of like authentic response to it. So sorry, not sorry.
Okay.
We're getting to the point to where a lot of the friction associated with obtaining these biomarkers is going to be reduced significantly. And we can use the analogy of just taking heart rate variability. There used to be a lot of friction associated with that, and now it's actually relatively easy. I saw a patent the other day for a contact lens that can measure cortisol.
Yeah.
Speaking of our cortisol ratio here. Yeah. And my point with that is instead of going into the doctor's office and getting a venipuncture and having all this kind of like rigmarole, we're going to, within the next few years, this is me extrapolating, within the next few or several years, we're going to get to the point to where a lot of these are just more accessible. It's either on demand, it's either on a patch, or we use a smaller, maybe even a dry blood spot type of testing, which is more readily accessible, or it's in real time, some combination of all of that.
Yeah.
I wanted to get your opinion on, is that going to be better or worse? Or how can we actually use that in the future? Because we've mentioned several times that a lot of the consternation with doing this testing is doing it on a frequent enough basis, getting enough samples, tailoring them to the individual. And in theory, the accessibility being improved is a way through a lot of that friction to where we can actually get some really good stuff, and we can, to kind of tailor training. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because that is absolutely starting to emerge and something that athletes will have to take into consideration in the very near future.
Absolutely. And I think it's already happening, and I think it's really exciting. We've still got lots to learn around many of these things. But if you take, for like, 2 other examples that come to mind, blood pressure monitoring used to be go to a doctor, white coat syndrome, have your blood pressure. But now you're sent away with an automatic monitor, and it takes samples throughout the day, and so the doctor can understand your blood pressure in a much more normal environment. And the same with glucose monitoring for diabetes. We've got real-time blood glucose monitoring, continuous blood glucose monitoring, so we can understand what that pattern is like across a day. There's more and more examples that that are going to come out all the time. HRV that we can measure continuously. There's things like it would be lovely if we could measure things like hepcidin continuously. So hepcidin is the iron controller. So it will tell us when is hepcidin low, and therefore we should take our iron to optimize the absorption. Inflammation monitoring is seen in some of the athletes that we work with. Actually NFL players, some of them are chronically inflamed because of the head impacts and the size they have to be, the training they have to do. And it's a small portion of them that seem to be chronically inflamed. And we know that because we're testing them several times in a week and several times through the season, as opposed to just a single health check at the beginning of the season and one at the end. And then you get an idea about the total exposure of that individual to inflammation. And so I think there's a huge amount of development to go, we have to be cautious around other tissue, like you mentioned, or other fluids. You mentioned teardrop. There's also saliva. There's interstitial fluid. All of these are going to be further away from the kind of the site of most injury, which is the muscle, or it's the organs, or it's the brain. And so we're already removed from that with a blood test. So we're even further removed with saliva and other markers. So we have to really understand, does it reflect what's happening more systemically? So there's lots of things like that to sort out. But it's hugely exciting to be able to measure. I mean, even GPS, like we didn't used to be able to measure running speed and distance with the accuracy that we can now with such ease across all of our training. And so it's going to be the same with biomarkers.
Somehow I think that you're going to have to come back on the podcast in like 2 years and explain how we're going to use our continuous cortisol monitor in an effective manner, because you're absolutely right. Not only do we have all of the things that we just talked about that kind of complicate it, you're also talking about the fact that it's further removed from whatever the original impact is, that further clouds the assessment that you're trying to apply to the biomarker.
Yeah. So we end up with a sort of a tsunami or of data that we have to make sense of. Yeah, we want to put all of this together. But there's opportunity there too, because I think when you have multiple biomarkers all flagging up as red, concern, out of range, the athletes get more and more confident they need to back off the training, recover, versus focusing entirely and obsessing over just sleep or just one particular biomarker that's not going to tell you the whole picture. So I think it is exciting to see how those new tools of the future are going to put everything together and then work out the thresholds. And conversations about those individualized ranges become very simple when you're talking about one biomarker at a time. But when you're talking about 15 different biomarkers, or 100 different biomarkers, all with their own adaptive ranges, and then trying to work out which ones are the most important, it can become complicated quite quickly.
So to kind of put a bow on all of this, I'm trying to pull out some major themes that we had talked about. Maybe you can kind of help me along the way so the listeners can kind of encapsulate the entirety of the discussion. The first one that we talked about is to understand that if you start using biomarkers, taking a less granular approach to the movement of those biomarkers is probably a good idea. You want to take a wide approach first and make sure that there's nothing kind of egregious going on. And then if you want to tailor those markers into your particular range, it is a very long proposition, perhaps maybe even 2 years, right? I mean, of getting enough data in order to make sense out of it. I want kind of further that proposition a little bit, like fundamentally what we just talked about. Are there any other kind of hero points that you want to kind of reemphasize to the listeners out there?
No, I think those points are good ones. Definitely obsessing over a single data point is something that's really ill-advised. I think trying to get.
I want to bring my cortisol down. That's the one that I always hear. My cortisol has to be as low as possible.
Yeah, cortisol is really important to manage inflammation, and so with athletes, you're going to have cortisol. We think of it as a stress hormone, but it's actually helping us manage that stress as opposed to being the stressor itself.
Right.
So that's an important nuance as well. But and there's many other biomarkers that we haven't really talked about. And the dietary one is an interesting one. And I know this isn't a summary point because it's a kind of new theme, but I think we saw some really interesting patterns with a cohort of fatigued athletes, and this is this unexplained underperformance syndrome or overtraining syndrome group, which is a poorly defined. But what we observed in that group is that biomarkers of oxidative stress all seem to be consistently different in the fatigue group compared to the healthy group, and that many of those were related to dietary fruit and veg intake. We think about dietary fruit and vegetables as being our kind of 5 a day as a standard recommendation. Well, for athletes, it's probably more like 8 to 10 per day. And we were seeing, particularly young athletes, very low levels compared to healthy controls. So another one is fatty acids and fish oils. You talked about salmon at the beginning of the talk, but there's good evidence that there's multiple systems that might be affected by these healthy fats. And that's very easy to measure too. So going off on a bit of a tangent, but I think there's that nutritional piece. You can get quickly to insights about your diet quality by measuring some of those biomarkers that would take you weeks and weeks to do via dietary analysis, for example. So I would kind of recommend looking at those too.
But the interventions always, this is just me being cynical, the interventions always come down to train correctly, eat more, and sleep more. I mean, kind of eat more probably has some nuance to it, as you were just kind of mentioning. Yeah. But whenever we look at the practical like course corrections, it's like, well, you should be doing that anyway.
Yes. Yeah. You're right. I think everyone has their own kind of personal set points on what they think is the right diet or the right amount of sleep and the right, and most of us are not getting enough sleep. And so, even if you think you are getting enough sleep, there's probably ways that, you can potentially kind of optimize that. So, you're right. The fundamentals are always going to be the same. But the big one I think that's often overlooked within that is the multitude of stressors. So it's not just, you've got the training load and you can compensate for that with good sleep and good nutrition, but there are other things that you're carrying with you. There's a term I like to use called allostasis, allostatic load, which is probably a whole different podcast, but this is, it takes into account all of those stresses and how we remain stable through that. And it's, and what the long-term impact can be of those stresses. But that total load, not just the training stress load, is important as well.
100%. And so I already booked you now for 2 podcasts. We're going to talk about allostatic load. And then 2 years from now, we're going to come back and talk about continuous cortisol monitoring. Charlie, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and entertaining some of my some of my personal coaching questions, but also this is enlightening for the audience. Before we let you go, tell listeners where they can find more about you and your research, and then where they can find more about Orreco.
Sure. So Orreco.com, that's ORRECO.com I consult with them pretty consistently on particularly on the biomarker front. And then my research, if you look up St Mary's University, Twickenham, or look me up on Google Scholar, you'll find my research papers on there.
I will have links to all those in the show notes. And thank you for being very practical and honest about this. A lot of times when we bring on researchers, that have this intertwining within the commercial space, and I tend to be a cynic of the commercial space more often than not. Sometimes they're a little bit guarded, but I appreciate your really practical approach to it, and it's really refreshing to hear.
Great, no, that's nice to hear. Thank you.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Charlie for coming on the podcast today and helping us to demystify this ever complicated landscape of blood testing, blood profiling, and how we can actually use it to inform training. This is one of those areas that I got to be honest, I'm always quite reluctant to do with athletes because it's complicated, and yet we have to simplify it kind of all at the same time. The blood testing can be quite nuanced, and we try to look at very small deviations in some of these blood profiles. And in many cases, what we really need to be doing is broadening the lens out and looking at broad patterns. And just as I mentioned several times during the course of the podcast, trying to use a little bit of terrain trap avoidance, particularly when we're using intensified training periods and or altitude interventions. But at the same time, it's nuanced enough that we need to also provide a very critical lens to it. And I firmly believe that the best solution to this is to get with a practitioner that knows this area very well, that you can rely on in order to weed through the results in a very personalized manner. So if you do decide to undertake blood profiling, try to keep that in mind as you're going through it, is that you are going to get a lot of noise and perhaps very little signal associated with your particular blood profiling test. I hope this podcast provided a little bit of guidance into any of those endeavors. I appreciate the heck out of all you listeners out there. If you liked the content contained within this podcast, please share this podcast with your friends and your training partners. That is the way that we get the word out. I do not monetize this podcast in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it is a loss leader for me. It costs me money every single month to produce this, and I'm happy to do it as long as you guys find the information valuable. And I appreciate you guys sharing the information with your friends and your training partners. That is it for today, folks. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.